Okay, good evening, everyone, and good morning to you, Tim. Thank you for being prepared at this relatively early hour of the morning in Exeter to talk to us. Uh, I'm Thomas Neitzert. I'm the current president of Engineers for Social Responsibility, and I'm also the secretary of the Wise Response Society. There are a number of NGOs that have come together today to sponsor this talk. We got to know about your very good work later last year. We knew about tipping points, but the concept of planetary solvency was new to us, and we thought that's something that would really be good to expose to a wider audience here in New Zealand. So, perhaps in terms of an introduction, Professor Tim Lenton is the founding director of the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter in the UK and chair in climate change and Earth system science. He has more than 25 years experience focused on modeling of the biosphere, climate, biogeochemical cycles, and associated tipping points. Tim is renowned for his work identifying climate tipping points, which informed the setting of the 1.5-degree climate target, associated net zero targets, and nationally determined contributions. Tim works with policymakers and businesses, helping them assess the risk of climate change and nature loss and highlighting the opportunities for positive impact, positive tipping points that can accelerate change towards net zero. In 2023, Professor Lenton led a team of more than 200 people from over 90 organizations in 26 countries to produce an authoritative assessment of the risk and opportunities of both negative and positive tipping points in the Earth system and society. The Global Tipping Point Report, which is online available, produced in partnership with the Bezos Earth Fund, was published at COP28. And I was just made aware today that in this year's King's Honors List, Tim has been rewarded for his excellent work with an OBE. So without further ado, I like to hand over to Tim to his presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks to all of you for your interest in coming along in your evening, I guess. I should let you know to start with that both my kids have got dual citizenship New Zealand passports. My wife's from Hamilton. Yeah, I'm a bit tired in my morning today because I was speaking yesterday evening in London, but we'll see how we go. We can share a link to the Planetary Solvency report if you haven't already seen it. Most of the talk is about the tipping points work on the bad tipping points and the good tipping points, but the work on planetary solvency came about because friends of mine from the actuary sector were really motivated for us to collaborate. And the great thing about actuaries is that they ask, is a company solvent if a 1 in 200 year event happens or not? And if they're not, then they need to do something about it to make sure they are solvent. And we very rarely take that approach to the climate, or the Earth as a system. But our central proposition is we really should be looking at it in the same kind of risk management problem. And it's probably obvious to you all that when we do that, if we look in the tail of a probability distribution like that, we rapidly conclude that we're not planetarily solvent, that the risks we're running with climate change and the rest of it are quite extreme, as I'll try and show you. So let me just get the slide share going. We can check that works. Oh yeah, that looks okay, I think. Great.
Yes.
So tipping points and planetary solvency. To continue on that opening theme, basically, the climate science community and perhaps science in general, if it was presented with the possibility that there's metaphorically on the Titanic, for example, and there might be an iceberg ahead, but the typical scientific position is we, especially in the IPCC and the climate sciences, We shouldn't say there's an iceberg there until we're fully confident there's one present. We basically concentrate on, as a climate science community, on saying what's the most likely thing to happen, what's the most likely level of global warming and the most likely consequences. And it's all of that that feeds into the economics of climate change and the policy making.
This meeting is being recorded.
Oh. But if you're a risk manager, you ask yourself, if or you're taking a risk approach, if there could be an iceberg in front, you think the first thing you think is, right, we need to steer well clear of that because the outcome will be catastrophic. The sort of the actuarial approach, as I said, and the risk manager will always ask first ask what's the worst thing that can happen, and can we rule it out? And if we can't, what can we do to avoid it? And that's the spirit in which I'm speaking. But in the climate space, that's not really been anyone's job. And maybe it's myself and my actuary friends who've been taking it upon ourselves as a mixture of risk professionals to make that our job. So from that general beginnings, I'll talk a bit about tipping points. This is me presenting a model of a system I'm forcing towards a tipping point. It's a system which has alternative stable states, like, for example, you could be sat upright on your chair, or you could be sprawled on your back on the floor, and they're two alternative stable states, and there's a tipping point between them. But in this case, it's a bit more subtle because I'm making the initial state of the system less stable over time until at that point there, it tipped from that initial state that had lost stability into the other state. And whenever you have a tipping point in a system, it's because what were some damping or negative feedbacks in the system that maintained the old status quo created the valley on the left. They're getting weaker, and then there's some amplifying feedback, positive feedback within the system that's getting stronger. And at the tipping point, it takes over and is strong enough to create a self-propelling change. So I don't need to keep forcing the system. The ball's going to keep rolling down the hill under its own momentum, as it were. But that's really the momentum of amplification within the system, taking a small change and amplifying it into a bigger change. And we'll turn to the tipping points in the climate in a second. But just for the context, this is the global temperature record. And it shows us, for example, with the extrapolation line, that we're heading towards 1.5 degrees centigrade of global warming in the middle of 2030 at the moment. So we're going to sail past the goal of the so-called Paris Agreement on climate change to try to strive to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. Tragically, we are going to overshoot that, and I'm going to talk a bit about the consequences of overshoot in a minute. But you also see a lot of like orange circles and wiggly line of the ongoing temperature variations. And as you're probably aware, we've just gone through, or we're still in, an unprecedented interval of warm anomaly relative to the trend line, which as climate scientists, we're frankly struggling to come up with a consensus explanation for. But one thing I will say is if you were watching the ball carefully in the video or the movie before, you'll see that before a tipping point, the ball is going to undergo larger fluctuations from the mean, the middle of the valley. And those fluctuations are going to be longer lived as the ball's moving around in a shallower valley than it was before. So it's a general sign of destabilization if you see larger and more persistent anomalies in a system. And it's fair to say that's what we see in the global temperature record, which doesn't mean that we're heading towards some overarching tipping point, but it is a sign of what we'd call loss of resilience or loss of stability in the climate. Now, climate. So then I've spent about 20 years trying to identify which are the big bits of the climate system that could pass the tipping point as global warming increases. And this isn't all of them, but it gives you a sense of a few of them, and also a sense of the changes that are going on in these key bits of the climate system. I'm going to say a bit more in a bit more detail about some of these. In particular, I'm going to focus on the Atlantic overturning circulation, as it's called, in a minute. But let's just note that not only are there several bits of the climate system that could tip in a way that's going to be damaging to us, but also the arrows indicate that this is a connected system. It's, you might think metaphorically, a bit like an organism, and if you disrupt or have a catastrophe in one organ of the body, it tends to have consequences for other bits of the system. The same is true in the climate. So, for example, unfortunately, the way things are wired up, tipping one thing can tend to make tipping another more likely in the climate. And at the moment, we see, for example, there's this weakening of what's called the great overturning circulation of the Atlantic. But that's linked to the fact that the Arctic is warming up at an unprecedented rate because the sea ice is melting away, and you replace a really reflective white sea ice surface with a really dark ocean surface that absorbs more sunlight. That warmer Arctic that's warming up about 4 times as fast as the global average. Well, not only is it warmer, but it also has more rain and snowfall because the atmosphere is now holding more moisture. That's triggered, the Greenland ice sheet is being triggered to melt faster because of the warmth. So you get more fresh water pouring off the Greenland ice sheet and from the hydrological cycle as it's got warmer. So you have fresh water pouring into the North Atlantic in increased amounts. And as I might say a bit more about in a minute, that's what's contributing to slowing down the great overturning circulation of the ocean that in turn sets weather and how strongly monsoons happen around the tropics, including over the Amazon. And it moves an awful lot of heat from the Southern Ocean up to where I am. And if you slow it down, that heat stays behind. So that would have some consequences for you over in New Zealand and so on. Right. So we've spent about 20 years, as I said, assessing in a broad sense on this figure how are we in the danger zone or not for bad climate tipping points that could have big impacts. And I'll show you some of the impacts in a minute. And 20 years ago, we thought, well, it would take 4 or 5 degrees centigrade of global warming to be at the point where these tipping points really became as likely as not. Although if we'd taken the risk managers approach back then, we would already have been alarmed that there was some risk hinted at by the yellow colouring here at low levels of global warming. The big problem is every time we reassessed, we assessed that the risk was greater than we thought it was before, so that now even the fairly conservative IPCC community assessment is that we're not at low likelihood of passing climate tipping points at the current levels of warming, which is now more like 1.35 degrees C. We're already at a pretty high likelihood. And from an actuary's perspective, the risk is really serious. We really, as we'll see, we really look insolvent at a planetary scale in terms of the climate risk. Now, we can break this down into more detail. I could have shown you some more detailed maps of all of these systems that could tip, and I should probably say a bit more about the consequences of tipping now. But these burning embers, as I call them, they're just summarizing, okay, there's some uncertainty about where the tipping point is, for example, to lose the Greenland ice sheet, which would ultimately give the world 7 more meters of sea level rise, or to lose the West Antarctic ice sheet, which would ultimately give 3.5 meters of sea level rise, or to lose the coral reefs, which would affect the livelihoods of about 500 million people, or to lose the permafrost, abruptly thawing, adding carbon dioxide and methane to the atmosphere, adding to the warming. Any one of these tipping points has some uncertainty because different models will give you different answers. We've got our best estimates of where the tipping point might be in the dotted line. It's global warming up the Y scale. The current level is something like the grey line at the bottom. Where we're heading later this century is the darker grey line with the shaded area of uncertainty. That's under current policies. We're going to about 2.7 degrees centigrade of global warming. As you can see, that would be highly insolvent. We'd be highly likely to have crossed a bunch of tipping points and be at risk of many others. I've just given you a hint of some of the kind of long-term irreversible commitments we'd be making if we cross what we think are the nearer tipping points. Things tip at different rates. Ice sheets are slow systems compared to the human perception of time, but still we could be committing to this irreversible 10 meters of long-term sea level rise if we are passing tipping points for these two big ice sheets. And there's about, well, nearly 1 billion people living within 10 meters of sea level at the moment, and so on. So those are the systems there, those four, perhaps the nearest risks, if you like. There's another one which I labelled Labrador Sea, which definitely concerns me here in the UK. Maybe it will concern you a little less than New Zealand, but nevertheless, I'll show you what it does to the UK in a minute. And then over here, there's the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, as we call it, or AMOC for short. And that really is, as I've hinted already, the big connector of the climate system. And it's got a huge uncertainty around the tipping point, but since we published this study, a bunch of recent work would suggest the tipping point could be nearer than we thought, and we should bring the dotted line down. What is this Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation? What's it got to do with the Labrador Sea, which is the area up here to the southwest of Greenland? Well, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, is the Atlantic bit of this overall circulation of the ocean I'm showing you, that also obviously comes past New Zealand. Red is the surface warmer water currents, and blue is deep water currents that are colder, deep being thousands of meters down in the Atlantic. In the Atlantic sector, there's an overall overturning circulation or conveyor belt, if you like. In fact, you can look at the whole global thing as a conveyor belt. But we know from Earth history that this overturning circulation in the Atlantic can be tipped off. It was tipped off and back on again 25 times during the last ice age, for example. This system, why do we care about it? We'll see that in a minute, especially if we live in the UK like me, because it brings a massive amount of heat to Western Europe and makes it a much milder climate than it otherwise should be at these high latitudes. How does this great overturning work, or what's driving it? Well, it's a process called deep water formation that's labelled up here, either side of Greenland. So basically what's happening is surface waters that are coming northwards in the Atlantic, they're losing heat to the atmosphere as they head north, and that's making them colder, obviously, and therefore the water's getting denser because it gets colder. They're also evaporating fresh water to the atmosphere, which is making them saltier, the water left in the ocean, which is also making it denser. And when it gets either side of Greenland, it gets dense enough, the water at the surface, to deep convect, we call it, to sink from the top of the ocean to thousands of meters down. That is in a sense driving the overturning circulation because it draws in new water from the tropics. And there's this strong amplifying built-in feedback that brings in the supply of dense water that supports the overturning. So if you switch it off, it doesn't switch back on again. It's an alternative stable state. Anyway, the risk is as you warm the world up and you have extra fresh water as well pouring into the North Atlantic, both effects, the warming Arctic and the freshwater input, are tending to weaken and potentially tip off this circulation. And it might be that the one area of deep water formation in the Labrador and Erminger Seas, they're called, is the more vulnerable to tip off first, followed by the other region up here. It's called the Greenland, Iceland, Norwegian Seas, and then we lose the whole thing. So if we just look at some of the impacts, sorry to be parochial, I wish I had as good a material on New Zealand, but as a Brit, I have a bit of parochial interest in the fact that if we lose just the sinking to the southwest of Greenland in the Labrador Sea, then we get, for example, in the climate extremes, we get 2 months less growing season in parts of Britain. So we definitely have some issues for food security. If we lose the whole Atlantic overturning circulation in a world that's 2 degrees C warmer, then Britain becomes a very different place, especially in the winter. So we see this on the left, there's some blue colours indicating that indeed the winters despite the world being 2 degrees C warmer, the winters are now a lot colder in Europe, although in Africa it's still like the rest of the world getting warmer. And there are some contours on here which are that how cold are the once in a decade extremes in this altered climate with the tipping point? Well, they're minus 30 degrees C extremes in Edinburgh or minus 20 degrees C in London. Why is this? Because on the right, in the winter, losing this massive supply of heat from the ocean means that the Arctic sea ice now suddenly recovers to the extent that in winter, by February, it extends down and covers most of the North Sea, wraps around Scotland, and leaves us essentially each winter in something that would feel like the Ice Age. Weirdly, the summers are barely cooled, so we still have summer heat waves that are worse than the pre-industrial climate. Here's a once in a decade climate extreme relative to the pre-industrial climate, which is obviously colder than where we are now. And it shows, for example, on the right that you get an additional 133 frozen days in Edinburgh in this decadal climate extreme. There would be about 30 frozen days in the pre-industrial climate in Edinburgh. So if you add that up, you've got 5.5 months of frozen conditions in Edinburgh, and in London it's well over 2 months. So that's a completely different climate, and I don't think the UK is in any way, shape, or form ready to try and adapt to that. We've published other work some time ago where we showed that this would basically eliminate arable farming from the UK, from Great Britain here, and it would cause a massive water crisis because the climate would be a lot drier overall. In fact, there wouldn't be enough water to supply the needs in the summer of all the people who are mostly down in the southeast of the UK, clustered around London. And then in the global picture, it doesn't look good either. There's very widespread drying, including in the monsoon regions of India and West Africa, and right across the growing regions of Europe and North America. And purple here means major reduction in the suitability to grow the staple crops of wheat and maize. Green means it gets better, but it's not very comforting to see that you'll be able to grow, wheat or maize on the Antarctica Peninsula where nobody lives. When overall what happens is the suitability to grow these crops reduces by more than a half globally. So that would be a global food security crisis in simple terms, unless everybody turned vegetarian and stopped wasting massive areas of land that to produce a modest number of calories and modest amount of protein from eating meat, which is so food security crisis, water security crisis if we pass this example tipping point. I hope that tells you enough, even though I didn't focus on New Zealand, that this is an extraordinary risk and one we should be doing everything in our power to minimize, because we are not solvent as a society or as a planet if we cross that tipping point. So what do we need to do? I think everybody probably on the call knows what we need to do, which is stop causing the problem, which means in simple terms, stop burning fossil fuels as soon as possible. Also have some shifts in diet, as I've hinted, and associated uses of the land. How quickly do we need to stop the emissions of CO2 that historically were creeping up in the Green Line? Well, we really need to be trying to shut everything down within a generation by 2050. Now, that is a spectacular rate of change that's required to bend the curve, if you like, and go down a steep decline in emissions. In fact, we would need to go more than 5 times quicker than we are globally at doing what we call decarbonizing the economy. So you might think, oh, the situation is hopeless, but I wanted to turn to talking about how it's not hopeless and give you a sense that we have instances where we're already radically accelerating the change we need in technology and behaviors to go to zero emission alternatives. if you want to read more, you're going to have to wait until I think it's the 4th of September. I've written a book about all the stuff I'm going to touch on now. But the concept is basically we can also justify applying the tipping point concept to the changes we need in the technologies and the behaviors that give rise to the greenhouse gas emissions. It's like we're in an unsustainable state of the economy powered by fossil fuels. There's plenty of damping feedback maintaining the status quo, like governments tend to subsidize the extraction and consumption of fossil fuels. But there's definitely an alternative state powered by renewable energy that will be equally a stable state. And there, as we'll see, there are some ways in which actions can destabilize the incumbent way of doing things and work with feedbacks within a system to tip from one state to another. I'm a bit conscious of time, so I might speed up a bit, but I want to believe that we could change fast and fundamentally, we need to persuade, well, it helps to know that we have in the past. So just quickly on that, this is my relative Lillian Lenton, photographed about just in 1913, so over 100 years ago. The number on her jacket, well, might indicate to you that she's in prison in this photograph because she's one of the suffragettes who's just been caught red-handed with her accomplice for burning down the tea house in Kew Gardens in this instance. Because as part of their protest for votes for women or universal suffrage, to draw attention to the cause, the militant suffragettes were quite using burning buildings and other strategies, quite rightly, to draw attention to their cause. In prison, Lillian went on a hunger strike immediately. She was force-fed. In this particular instance, this was only 3 or 4 days into being in prison. They put the tube down the wrong way into one of her lungs, poured in liquid food and nearly drowned her. But then something interesting happened. They released her to the care of her friends out of prison, but the Home Secretary at the time lied about what had happened, claimed she was just ill because of the hunger strike, and there was a national outcry about this, the fact that it was kind of obvious that the state was lying about what was happening. And this was one of many events that started shifting public opinion, which was often quite strongly against the militant suffragettes, to empathise and sympathise with their cause. But of course, it took a while to then get a radical change in democracy, double the voting population. But it was the actions of a brave few, shall we say, that fundamentally changed the democratic system for everybody. And we see also a brave few starting climate protests in the last 10 years or so. And protest movements have their own very strong amplifying feedbacks behind them. So Greta Thunberg here, by skipping school, starting her protest on a Friday outside the Swedish Parliament, makes it incrementally easier for the next person to break with the social norms of going to school and obeying the state and your parents and join in the protest, because you want a bigger social tipping point of norms to get the government acting decisively on climate change. And then the next person who joins the process makes it incrementally easier for the next person to join, and so on. So you have the recipe for exponential growth. And I was able to calculate just from early photographs of the protest that the protest population doubled roughly once a week. I reckon if you're engineers by training, you know the answer to what happens if you keep doubling for, say, 20 weeks. You'll know that you would get 1 million people protesting, and that's pretty much what happens in the climate protest, Fridays for the Future. And within a year, you have many governments declaring climate and ecological emergencies. This is a picture of the European Parliament doing so. So that's them acknowledging that their policies aren't good enough. They need to be stronger. But of course, it's all just words, 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 or blah, 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 as Greta would say, unless we also change the activities, the behaviors, the technologies that give rise to greenhouse gas emissions. But then we know we can change technology fast, and we've done in the past. So if we rewind to 1900 in this case, this is a photograph of the Easter Day parade on Fifth Avenue, New York City in the year 1900. Everyone's dressed up in their finery on the sidewalk, and everybody's out on their horse-drawn carriage in the street, barring one person who's in an early automobile. I don't know if you can spot them. They're just here in the middle of the street coming towards us. But if we fast forward 13 years, actually to the time when Lillian had just been released from prison to the care of her friends, and we look at another photograph of Easter Parade, New York City in 1913, you got the opposite challenge of spotting the person who's left in a horse-drawn carriage. They are actually in the same place on the street over here coming towards us. But the point is, this is a major tipping point in personal mobility, from carriages to cars. It spreads rapidly, first among the rich, then out to in the cities and out to the rural areas and so on. It changes the whole system. Roads get built, gas stations, etc., etc. There's really strong reinforcing feedbacks in this tipping point. The fact that the more cars that get built, the cheaper they get to build, like Henry Ford comes up with a Model T production line. The cost of a Model T Ford drops from $980 when it's first sold in 1908. But by 1925, it's dropped in price to something like $300 or less, thanks to economies of scale. And the cars have got better through what's called learning by doing. The more we make them, the better we get at making them. And so those are really strong reinforcing feedbacks. It's a classic example of what gets called diffusion of innovations and produces what's called an S-curve of adoption or uptake of the new technology. And this is a story basically for adoption of any new technology. There's always some people who want to try it first or maybe even developed it. There's some people who are sympathetic to the new technology and are early adopters. There are some people who say, over my dead body, am I going to get an electric car or whatever it is? But it doesn't take everybody to change to tip the system. It takes a fraction, and that fraction varies depending on the system. I've sketched it here as if it was around 20% of people need to change before the system tips, and ultimately everybody will change. Sometimes it's a lot less than that. The exciting news is, though, we're seeing these tipping points to the new clean technologies, at least in some markets. So let's stick with cars and have a look at Norwegian car sales. You see that they've undergone the S-curve change. The green is the market share of different types of electric vehicle. The dark green is 100% battery electric cars now dominating the market in Norway. And this is a pretty fast tipping of the market. Why Norway? Well, because it turns out some social activists photographed here in 1989 lobbied, you could say, the government to impose a bunch of policies that would incentivize the uptake of electric vehicles, like waiving VAT or waiving the import registration tax or waiving road tolls. In the interest of time, I'm not going to tell you this great story, but it's really their actions that set what I call the enabling conditions for experimentation, if you like, with this new technology in Norway. And then as soon as major manufacturers put EVs onto the market in around 2011, you saw the tipping point happen. Actually, at that time, around 2011-12, the total cost of owning an EV in Norway is comparable to owning a petrol or diesel car, partly because of some policy support. But the point about the amplifying feedbacks is the more people who adopt an electric vehicle, the cheaper the electric vehicles are going to get and the better they're going to get. Because basically the battery in the vehicle is getting better and cheaper the more we make them, thanks to all the innovation of all the great engineers working on it. So in this plot, the dotted lines and the left-hand scale is the price of batteries plummeting a factor of 10 over a decade. And I could also tell you that the range you can get from a given mass of battery went up by nearly a factor of 3 in the same decade. And the bar chart is the global population, if you like, of electric vehicles exponentially growing and doubling every year and a half. Batteries are continuing to plummet in price now, despite the wobble here that was Russia invading Ukraine. So that amplifying feedback in the system means you need less and less policy to support the fact that electric vehicles are becoming the cheaper option. And at that point, the tipping point is kind of self-propelling, but it's useful in other aspects. It's important for the climate because about 12% of greenhouse gas emissions just come from road transport. But that tipping point gives cheap batteries to potentially tip other parts of the economy. So an obvious one is when you've got a load of cheap batteries, suddenly electrifying goods transport becomes the cheaper option. And we've just published a report on how close that tipping point is. Also, as we see the tipping point to electric mobility, it means there's a load of oil in the ground that there won't be any need for. It's a stranded asset. We don't need, the major demand for oil is road transport. And as that tips to electric, the oil assets are stranded, which in my view is a tremendous thing, but it does mean that some companies need to rethink their identity. Our pension funds need to adjust what they're invested in. And then cheap batteries are super important for a bigger tipping point, which is the one in the power sector to renewable energy. Because I suspect you all know as engineers that you need to balance electricity supply and demand. And when you want to watch the telly or boil the kettle isn't always when the sun's shining and the wind is blowing. So you need some cheap electricity storage in the 100% renewable electric future, and batteries are going to be a lot of that storage. So I just want to talk briefly about tipping points in the power sector, electricity, because that's still a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. But here's the data from the UK that shows you that we've had a tipping point in the power sector. The black line is coal burning contribution to UK electricity. 40% in 2012 of our power supply comes from burning coal, and it absolutely fell off a cliff whilst we've been having this slower exponential growth of renewables. Why does it fall off a cliff? Well, there's really strong amplifying feedback in the system. Basically, several things are going on. As renewables are growing, they're always the first thing you turn to for electricity because they generate for free. What do you turn to next? Traditionally, you turn to coal because it's cheaper than gas. But the UK government put what's called a floor price on carbon emissions in the power sector, and they promised they were only going to ever step it up over time. And that penalises coal burning more than gas burning. And basically, the economics of burning coal started turning bad. Then investors withdrew from coal burning, which made it even more expensive. So other investors withdrew in a kind of fire sale. And that's why coal burning fell off a cliff. We had a 10% per year reduction in emissions from the power sector as we went down this S curve. And if you're wondering, we know it's okay, there might have been a temporary increase in gas burning, but now that 40% of our power supply that was coming from coal is coming from renewables, and they're climbing all the time. And it's an irreversible tipping point. We destroy the coal power stations like this one in Oxfordshire. But in the global picture, the story is one about how the more solar panels and the more wind turbines we make, the cheaper and the better they get. So this is the data for solar panels. It's a log graph. You probably know what that is. I usually have to explain that to the audience. And look at the data for the price of a solar panel as more are deployed from 2008 to 2018. They fall in price by an order of magnitude. In fact, every doubling of installed solar capacity leads to roughly a 25% reduction in the price of a solar panel over the multiple decades since the 1970s. So now solar power is the cheapest in most of the world, even if you factor in the battery storage you also need. And it's dropping in price faster than wind power. So that's why my colleague Femke in this paper projects that for everywhere in the world, pretty much, bar a few places that are very windy, by the end of the decade, solar plus battery storage is the cheapest form of electricity and the cheapest electricity there's ever been. So that's important because fossil fuel electricity stayed on average the same price for over a century. It has no real economies of scale. So we're heading into this new renewable, cheaper power supply future, and it's going to be a big incentive to electrify every activity we can. So we've been modeling out not just the major sectors like the power sector, cars and trucks, and heat pumps for homes, but we've just started modeling out the coupling between sectors. So I kind of hinted that the cheap batteries coming from the car sector are enabling the switch to renewable power. In fact, they're literally going to come out of cars secondhand and onto the grid, as they are doing now, as well as have cars plugged into the grid with light vehicle to grid two-way interchange. But as you get cheaper renewable electricity, well, that reinforces the transition to electrified transport, because now it's even cheaper to run your electric car or your electric truck, or indeed your electric heat pump. So there's basically a load of reinforcing feedbacks between the sectors as well as within them. And without giving you all the gory detail, I can send you the report. We model this stuff out. We can model, are we tipping globally each of the sectors, power, home heating, cars, trucks, and what's happening on the current trajectory, and which of these policies is the most effective to tip the system if it's not going to tip already. Well, the power sector is already tipping, but basically, and heat pumps to some degree, it's already the system is tipping. But if we want to tip all of the sectors, the most effective way to do it is have our governments mandate phasing out the fossil technology and phasing in the clean technology. In other words, you can say you're not going to be able to sell a petrol or diesel car or a diesel truck in our market after, say, 2035. That's the way to, if you like, activate all the amplifying feedbacks of innovation that bring down the price and improve the quality of the clean alternatives. Right. That might have gone on slightly longer than I hoped, but hopefully it was interesting, and hopefully it gives you a sense that we're not powerless in the face of like planetary insolvency or huge risks. There's lots of things we can do, and lots of things people are already doing, the technology innovators, the policymaker innovators, but also the citizens who are choosing to adopt the clean technology or to move where their pension fund is invested or lobby for that to be moved. We don't have to put our lives on the line like my relative Lillian, but we do have to do something. And there's lots of different things we can do, as I've hinted. And my team, we're busy publishing and working away on this, basically creating a kind of how-to recipe for how you can identify if your sector in a market like your own has a positive tipping point, what activities would bring it forward, can we sense if it's close, and so on. But the little stories I touched on basically tell us that it's a systems problem, and the most effective change will happen when you have like the bottom up of social movements kind of working together with the top down of policy, with some support from shifting money, finance, and some innovative businesses getting behind the change, and maybe the media telling a different story of change. So yeah, I think despite the insolvency risk, I think we could still do it. I'm not going to say we will do it because it's conditional on people like you accepting my argument and getting behind the change. But the summary would be we are facing these extraordinary risks in climate change of basic insolvency of our societies. The only way we can credibly limit the risks or limit global warming to well below 2 degrees C now is through a radical acceleration of action. Incremental change is not going to do it. But I tried to show you that there are radical acceleration of change is possible and is happening in key sectors, and we know what caused it or what triggered it. So we need to do more of that. Thanks for your attention. Hope you found that interesting. You can read lots more on the Global Tipping Points website resource if you want, but I'll stop the screen share and open up for questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Tim, for a very concise presentation of your work and the problem and potential solution. And I really like your optimism. But
Awesome.
think we have a few people here in the room from the degrowth movement, and I think there are already some concerns coming up. Radical
Quite
change,
rightly.
yes, but whether the radical change is actually going towards greater technology and more growth and so on
Yeah, I should
will have
probably
to be seen. But
I
yes,
should definitely head that concern off because what I haven't shown you are some examples of tipping points to reducing consumption, which is absolutely critical as well.
yeah,
But I could have shown you the example, for example, in Japan of the fashion. It's actually, you could call it a fashion movement, but it was instigated by the government, and it's called cool biz fashion. But essentially, the air conditioning in the buildings of Tokyo was traditionally set down at 22, 23 degrees C, consuming masses of energy because the business people of Tokyo are walking around in Western suits, which is a totally alien to Chinese, Japanese dress like the kimono, which is really good at regulating your body temperature when it's super sweltering and hot in the summer. So what happens with Cool Biz is the then Prime Minister, this is 2005, by the way, and a bunch of famous athletes, media personalities, whatever, get behind a movement to change the social norms of dress, to have shorter sleeve shirts like I'm wearing now and looser slacks, at the same time as promising that they reset the thermostat in all the government buildings to 28 degrees C, saving a huge amount of energy and emissions. But this change in social norms of dress code caught on. It spread like wildfire, and you found that basically all sorts of businesses adopted also the lower energy demand option. Then, when Fukushima, the nuclear disaster, happens, they have what's called super cool biz because they had a crisis of electricity supply. They'd shut down all the nuclear power stations. They further relaxed the dress code, if you like, and further radically reduced consumption. So that was just one little story because I'm very sympathetic or supportive also of the argument. Yet there's loads of ways we should reduce excessive consumption. And I could hit you with all sorts of good news facts about how the UK has lowered its total per capita energy use by something over 20, approaching 25% just in the last 15 years, and nobody has noticed as far as I can see. We're also reduced our meat consumption about 15% in the same amount of time, and nobody seems to have cared. So yeah, enough said. I'll let you ask some questions,
yeah.
so crew.
I was just assuming we get some questions, so let's see what they are. Perhaps first one is Jack.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Tim. This whole idea of planetary solvency, I think, is a really critical contribution, and I really want to acknowledge that and thank your group, you and your colleagues for putting it in that perspective. It's such a common sense approach, but yet backed up by the science and the actuarial practices that have been so important in determining the solvency of companies. Um, I, I'm trying to formulate my question around the issue of the focus on climate, which is clearly of
Sure.
great significance, and the broader concept of ecological overshoot.
Yeah.
When one looks at the climate issue, it's said to be about 60% of overshoot. Overshoot, of course, being the
Yeah.
too much
Good.
demands on uh, nature's capacity to regenerate and
Absolutely.
to absorb wastes. So, has there been any consideration of extending the planetary solvency approach to taking a wider boundary
Uh,
perspective on climate and looking at ecological overshoot in terms of productive land availability, as well as pollution and the
uh,
capacity of ecosystems to absorb them, and human appropriation of net primary production, which has increased significantly, over the decades. You're very interested in whether the planetary solvency approach has been considered in that context.
Great question, Jack. I'm just going to write in the chat a link to the dashboard, which you can play with, folks, if you're at your leisure, but which is where we visualize our assessment on planetary solvency, not just for climate, but also for what we glibly or loosely call, I think they're nature, society, and economics. But to answer the question, yeah, we were right from the start, thinking in a more planetary boundaries or holistic way, if you like, about are we solvent with respect to these other crucial axes of nature, or each of the, if you know the planetary boundaries, each of those dimensions. So we absolutely want to continue working in that direction. We just found that we had more data, if you like, or we could work through the case study for climate. It was the obvious choice to do first and more thoroughly. But with Sandy Trust, my actuary friends, we're kind of looking for, frankly, we're looking for some support to keep doing the work, to go. And the next thing we're unpacking is what we could very broadly or term nature solvency, but we've got some specific work going on there that we've started and we want to do more. I've just submitted a paper on positive tipping points for nature, on kind of running through the logic we just went through, but for the case that we're still destroying nature, and yet our governments are committed supposedly that they're going to have stopped that destruction and be back in 2030 towards a state of net increase of nature, and by 2050 to restore all the nature we've lost. It's just the same story that requires a spectacular acceleration of change. So what case studies do we have that we can credibly do that? So your question is very well taken, because that's exactly what I and we are working on, is extending this thinking. And I just wrote a little popular article piece yesterday, sent it to the editor, about sort of how we need to transform the industrial metabolism, or the metabolism of a city, for example. What would it take to make it truly circular, and to reduce our overall ecological and material footprint? So I'm completely with you on that. Unless we go to that full system view, we're not out of trouble, or we're not solvent. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Next is Lindsay.
Thanks, Thomas, and thank you very much, Tim, for a fascinating discussion. And I very much like your holistic and systems thinking approach. I want to ask a question about the extent of biofuels that was showing in that diagram where you showed the drop-off of the generation. I've got data for Drax Power Station in Yorkshire, which essentially shows that all the wood pellets coming from Louisiana and other places, by the time they're all processed and go through the Drax system, there's almost a net energy loss. So it might look okay when they reach Drax, when they run in Drax, but all the losses upstream from there, in a global sense, pretty well cancel out the energy benefits. Can you comment at all on that, please?
I totally agree with you. I should have flagged that at the time, that the green wedge was not a good wedge. In fact, any kind of biofuel to electricity, different life cycle analyses and assessments give somewhat different answers. But my sentiment and analysis would be the same as yours. That's not it's not an improvement. So what I would emphasize, though, is the real good thing that's going on in the UK case is the expansion of offshore wind power. That's where the real action is. And if this Labour government manages to follow through on what it's set in motion, even within this Parliament, we should have probably eliminated gas burning in the UK, and definitely we should eliminate that sort of highly suspect biofuel into Drax story, because we could be heading to we will see, but 50, 60 gigawatts of installed capacity offshore wind for the UK. So on a windy day at the end of this decade, we could easily have the whole of the UK power demand supplied from wind. So yeah, your point's great. I think that the whole biofuels and biomass energy, carbon capture and storage is a big kind of misnomer actually, and it's been actively misleading in a lot of the climate projections actually, that the so-called integrated assessment models or modelers had baked in a load of assumptions that basically produced scenarios of an imagined future where there was going to be massive biomass energy with carbon capture and storage, and that's totally, in my view, not credible, wouldn't be net beneficial, and those scenarios need to be struck off in favour of the obvious answer, which is go as fast as you can now on renewables and electrification.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Dietre has got her hand up. Can you unmute yourself, Dietre?
You're muted, Deirdre.
Yep, I can. Is that right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good.
Tim, thank you for your presentation, and it's very positive news that there are social tipping points too. My concern is the political dimension,
Yeah.
because in our economic system, we have a built-in economic growth imperative, and that appears to be leading to more ruthless right-wing governments globally. I don't know whether I'm imagining that or not, but I'm noticing it, who want economic growth at all costs. So we've got this movement, two different movements in two different directions.
But if they did want economic growth at all costs, they seem to have not read they've not been done at Economics 101, have they? Because the craziness of Trump and the tariffs is already causing economic pain, and the voters are already switching their sentiment in the US because they're feeling the pain. So, but you're right to highlight the bigger problem, which is the economic system and the incentives are wired wrong, and will only ultimately get out of trouble when we have governments that will enact a proper valuation of punishing pollution, rewarding restoration of nature, etc. So the point is, though, that in democracies, however flawed they are, it's really up to the people, right? Who are they going to vote for? And sadly, we've seen that swing in a way many of us find distasteful of late. But I suppose what we need then is a credible message of abundance and flourishing that is with the change to the clean technology. I think it's partly a political failing on the part of those who want to see the transformation I've talked about, to not have packaged it as, hey, look at all the huge gains in this. Hey, cleaner air, your kids aren't, or you or your kids aren't dying of asthma, or the 5 or 8 million deaths per year that go straight from fossil fuel air pollution. Look at all the mental health benefits of renewing nature, blah, blah, blah. We could go on for another hour about this. But yeah, of course it's about the political economy and a political battleground. I am and to change that, especially in an era of populism, it really matters what the people want and what they're perceived to want by leaders who some of them aren't very good at leading anymore, because they change their behaviors and their policy every time they see the latest opinion poll or whatever swing in another direction. So yeah, there's too much to talk about there, but suffice to say, on growth, I would take the broader point, but also note that there is clear evidence of, at nation scales and counting for consumption-based emissions, that some economies, including the UK, can grow whilst decreasing emissions, also decreasing meat consumption, which is important, very important for nature. And arguably, although I'm sure some of you will want to have a long debate about this, we might be seeing the signs in the UK that even total material consumption could be going down. So I'm not going to advocate for crazy growth because we clearly need to change the economic system fundamentally. But when we are going through this great transformation, if we accept that we are going to, even if we've reduced our energy demand and our material demands, we're still going to have some energy demand. So accept that we need to have renewable energy and electrification. You have to build a lot of stuff to go from what we have now to there. And it's actually quite hard to avoid in any of our work or other people's modeling to not create some real economy, productivity, or growth in building a whole new infrastructure. There's a load of jobs in that, and that's already clear in the data. So I think that we need some nuance here because there will be a lot of good things. I mean, good employment, better jobs, better paid jobs in making the transition. I think as we're going through that, we then have to work out this fundamental shift in the economic system to a steady state economy and change a whole lot of stuff. But this transition is going to be super interesting because it's actually hard to avoid some things you might call growth, but not in a bad way, I'd say, in going through changing, the whole basis of the economy.
Mhm. Okay, there are a few more questions if you got time. Would Young
Oh yeah, I see we're over a bit, but I can hang on for a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, perhaps quickly, Budyong has got his.
Yep, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, sorry, my camera's not working. Thanks, Tim. I was interested that the whole talk, there hasn't been mention of critical minerals.
Yeah.
I'm aware that, just if we just take copper, that the world's richest sources of copper provided about 40 tonnes per 1,000. And then it went, eventually, I understand we've got down to about 0.4 tonnes now. And all of that mining has to be done with fossil fuels. And all of the talk that we hear from governments about renewables never talks about it.
Okay. Yeah.
I'd just like to make one more point. I've heard figures that have been calculated that just for the EU to meet their 2035 renewable energy targets would use all of the known copper resources on the planet. So everyone else on the planet would have to say, well, sorry, guys, you miss out because we need it to meet our target. And I find this just totally incongruous that we're in this situation where we keep talking about all this stuff that we're going to do. And not nobody, there are one or two people doing the numbers on what actual physical resources our planet, our Mother Nature can provide for us. So I'd really be interested in your comments.
Absolutely. So I'm a numbers guy, as you probably got a sense from the modeling, and we take those questions seriously. So we looked at the data, and so having worked it through ourselves, and okay, there are different sources and views on this, but we looked, for example, at the metal needs in the model, and there isn't a fundamental situation of like there isn't enough of this metal or that metal to make the transition, even the accelerated transition. There is a considerable demand on some metals, but also you gave, for example, the copper as an example. That's also something that you can achieve almost 100% perfect recycling of, because it tends to be used in the pure metal form in pipes and wires and the like. That's not always true of all metals, but it's also instructive to know that the total extractive industry, the amount of stuff, in simple terms, you need in the electrified renewable energy future is way less than what you have in the fossil fuel mining extractive economy. It's about a factor of 5 less in our estimate. Plus, there's a huge economic incentive to recycle all of the important metals that you've got in the electrified system, copper or critical metals. So we've been working on the numbers and the modeling it out, but it can be done. It's not that there's a fundamental shortage that we've hit up against. And it will be a really strong incentive to switch to a more circular economy, which is a good thing for a bunch of other reasons. Essentially, the future that I think is credible, where you have a steady state economy, is one where there's quite an abundant supply of cheap renewable electricity, and a fair chunk of that actually goes into powering what I call Gaia devices, but things that the system of remanufacture and recycling and cycling around all the critical metals and the rest of it that you make new stuff out of. You basically make new stuff continuously out of the old stuff. Obviously, to get to that place, you have to have you have to stop the net increase in demand of extraction, which is still the case for big things like steel, cement, etc. But there's also, as some of you know, a lot of scope to dematerialize stuff. So I'm a bit, having looked at the numbers, I'm more optimistic, and I won't deny that there aren't new demands and this will affect price and so on, and that we ought to be careful about not creating new harms in sourcing new materials we need. But at the end of the day, this is the path to a completely different economy where extractive industry is shrunk an awful lot and you're just cycling stuff round and round in the system. And that, in my view, is the place, again, that we've got to get to. But thanks. Yeah. All right.
Okay, I give Godfrey the last word to have a question.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Tim. What a brilliant presentation. I want to take a tiny little bit of your glory by saying I'm based in Hamilton, where your wife comes from.
Yeah, great. The river runs through it, I believe, is the slogan. Or it used to be the slogan.
That's right. But my question is relatively short. It is simply that you've made such a good presentation, and you've given certainly me, and if not others, the impression that there's a lot more to say on this subject. I would love to get my hands and my ears and my eyes on the bigger presentation that you have. Is there any way you can? Is there a lecture you're giving at some point that can go on Zoom or whatever?
Well,
whatever.
I don't know if you like reading books. It seems very unfashionable these days, but I've written what's not a particularly long book, which is probably a good thing, 80,000 words, but it's coming out on the 4th of September. So I'll put, as you've asked, I'll put that in the chat, and you can pre-order if you want. It'll get cheaper when they switch to paperback. But I tried my best to kind of combine this great stories along with the data science and the modeling in that book without boring everybody by making it too long. So I hope that will give you a lot more to work on. And yeah, thanks for all your questions, folks. I mean, there is a lot more to say. There are a lot of ifs, buts, and what about this, and oh, this is a problem, and I totally get that. But I hope I conveyed that there isn't another credible option. It's transformation one way or the other. Either we're going to face something horrendous in the changing climate and the decimation of nature. Incremental change doesn't cut it. So the only other option is it is a transformative change of the economy and everything else. But you're all asking the right questions. Nobody has all the answers, but as a species, or whatever you want to think of us as, we're either going to step up and innovate and find the answers to transform everything, or we're not. But we're not going to do that unless we believe that that there is a possible sustainable, flourishing future. That's so that's what I take as the bottom line. That's why I might come across as weirdly a mix of doomist and optimistic. Because if we don't have what people would call conditional optimism, like I have conditional optimism that other people will get on board with this thinking, and only that way could we get out of trouble. So it's not naive optimism. But yeah, thanks for listening, and I hope I inspired some of you to join me.
Yeah, thank you once again, Tim, for your presentation. It was extremely informative, and you pointed us also to your work. So I can only encourage people not to wait for the book, but go to your website. There is material. There are these reports that you have
There's a lot.
created.
Yeah, I'll put some on.
They are very informative to read. And also, I'd like to thank you for your positive attitude and these social tipping points that you pointed out. I think it gives us some encouragement, all of us here that are working in different spheres, to just keep going and encourage more to keep going with us, and hopefully we can make a difference.